The void above Cadia bled with the remnants of war. Twisted metal and frozen corpses formed a morbid constellation around the shattered planet, a grim monument to the fallen world below. Captain Thaddeus Verax of the Cadian 122nd watched from the observation deck of the Imperial transport Righteous Vigor as the vessel pushed through the debris field. His weathered face reflected in the armor glass, eyes the color of Cadian steel, scanning the void with practiced vigilance. "Emperor, preserve us," he whispered, fingers tracing the outline of the Aquila medallion at his throat. The superstitious gesture brought him little comfort as he gazed upon the broken remains of his home world. Cadia stood, but barely. The planet had been cracked open by the despoiler's final act of malice. Its surface rendered a wasteland of blackstone and radiation. Yet even broken, it remained a vital imperial stronghold against the Eye of Terror. A bastion manned by the stubborn survivors of the greatest catastrophe in recent imperial history. The convoy of which the Righteous Vigor was part carried fresh troops, munitions, and the precious resource of unaugmented Cadian youth. The fighting strength of the Imperium renewed itself through the blood of Cadia, even as that blood grew more scarce with each passing year. Verax turned as the deck officer approached, a data slate clutched in his trembling hands. "Sir, Auspex is reporting an anomaly in the warp currents ahead. The navigator cannot identify its nature." Verax took the slate, scanning the readouts with narrowed eyes. "Geller fields functioning at optimal capacity, sir. Whatever it is, it appears to be translating from the warp, but without the typical signature of Imperial or even known Xenos vessels." A cold sensation crawled up Verax's spine. 20 years of combat experience against the enemies of mankind had taught him to trust his instincts. Something was wrong. Alert the fleet. Battle stations, full void shields informed naval escort to move to intercept Vector. The officer saluted and hurried away. Verax returned his gaze to the viewport where the distant stars seemed to shiver and distort. A point of light appeared, growing rapidly in intensity until it burned like a newborn Sunday. Not the green of Necron technology, nor the crimson tear of a warp rift, but something else entirely, something unknown. The ship's warning klaxons began to wail as the light expanded, a corona of energy that rippled with unseen force. Verax braced himself against the viewing port railing as the Righteous Vigor shuddered violently. "Emperor, protect us," he muttered, watching as the light collapsed in on itself and then exploded outward in a silent burst that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. And then he saw it, a figure impossibly small against the void, yet somehow radiating a presence that Verax could feel even across the vacuum of space. A man, or something resembling one, suspended in the void without void suit or ship. White and blue garments clung to a muscular frame, and a shock of dark hair framed a face that seemed almost human, save for the moustache that adorned his upper lip. But it was the eyes that struck Verax with instinctive dread. Even at this distance, they burned with a cold intelligence that spoke of neither madness nor demonic possession, but something perhaps more terrifying: purpose. The Vox crackled to life, filling the observation deck with the panicked voice of the naval commander. Unknown entity approaching at impossible velocity. All ships evasive maneuvers. Too late. The figure moved, a blur of motion that defied comprehension. The nearest escort vessel, the light cruiser, Vengeance of Terror, simply came apart as the entity tore through its hull like a bolt round through parchment. There was no explosion, no dramatic burst of flames, simply the clinical separation of void-hardened steel and the brief silent scream of atmosphere venting into space. Verax watched in horror as the figure paused, hovering amidst the spreading debris, seemingly examining the destruction he had wrought with an almost academic interest. Then his head turned, and even across the impossible distance of void, Verax felt those eyes lock onto him, onto his ship. "Brace for impact," he roared, diving away from the viewport as the entity accelerated toward the Righteous Vigor. The collision was apocalyptic. The transport's void shields flared brilliant blue before collapsing entirely, overloaded by a force they were never designed to repel. The hull screamed as something tore through deck after deck, the ship's superstructure groaning in protest at the violation. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, sirens wailed, and the artificial gravity flickered and died, leaving Verax floating in a hellscape of twisted metal and sparking cables. Through the ringing in his ears, He could hear the death cries of his ship. The reactor alarms shrieked their warning of imminent catastrophic failure. Verax pushed himself through the zero-gravity environment, instinctively moving toward the nearest escape pod bay. All around him, crew members flailed in the weightless horror, some already dead from the explosive decompression, others desperately trying to seal breaches or reach safety. The entity appeared before him with such suddenness that Verax had no time to react. One moment, the corridor ahead was empty, save for floating debris. The next, it was occupied by the impossible figure, hovering effortlessly in the zero gravity as though it were his natural element. Up close, the resemblance to a human was even more unsettling. The entity appeared as a man in his prime, powerfully built, with an aristocratic bearing that reminded Verax of the high-born imperial officers he had served under. But the eyes, those eyes held no humanity, no mercy, no comprehension of the suffering around him. "Your weapons are primitive," the entity spoke, his voice carrying perfectly despite the vacuum that should have made it impossible. "Your ship's fragile. Tell me, is this the best defense your species can muster?" Verax's hand moved to his holstered last pistol, a futile gesture that the entity seemed to find amusing. "An insect with a torch," the being said, a smile touching his lips that never reached those terrible eyes. "I am Nolan Grayson of Viltrum. You may call me Omni-Man, and I have come to save your species from itself." Before Verax could respond, the ship lurched violently. The reactor containment had failed. Omni-Man tilted his head as if listening to the death throes of the vessel with mild curiosity. "Unstable atomic technology. Inefficient. Your deaths will serve a purpose. However, the survivors will spread word of my arrival. Fear is an effective teacher." With that, he was gone, moving with such speed that he seemed to simply vanish. Verax had only moments to seal his uniform before the final bulkhead gave way. Explosive decompression pulling him into the void. His last conscious thought as the cold of space began to claim him was that he had encountered something worse than any daemon or Xenos. He had met a god who viewed humanity as vermin. The Imperial convoy died in fire and silence. Of the 12 ships, only 3 managed to launch escape pods before their destruction. The Righteous Vigor broke apart as its reactor core went critical, the explosion claiming 2 nearby transports caught in the blast radius. The remaining vessels were methodically torn apart by the entity now known to the survivors as Omni-Man. Verax awoke in the sterile confines of a medic bay, the familiar smell of antiseptic and incense filling his nostrils. He tried to sit up only to be gently restrained by a servitor nurse. "The patient will remain stationary," it intoned in its flat mechanical voice. "The Mayos biologist has not yet completed his examination. Entity the destruction." He turned his head, taking in his surroundings. He was aboard another vessel, larger than the Righteous Vigor, judging by the scale of the medic bay. Rows of injured crewmen and soldiers occupied the beds around him, many with injuries consistent with void exposure and explosive decompression. "Captain Verax, you rejoin the Imperium of Man." The voice belonged to a figure that stepped into view at the foot of his bed. Robed in the deep crimson of the Adeptus Mechanicus, with multiple mechanical appendages extending from beneath the heavy fabric, the tech priest's face was more machine than flesh, with glowing optical units where eyes should have been. "Magos," Verax acknowledged weakly. "The convoy destroyed. Your life pod was recovered by the Mechanicus explorator vessel Omnisia's Truth. We detected the energy discharge and investigated. You're among 127 survivors of an estimated complement of 8,000 Imperial souls." The numbers hit Verax like a physical blow. Nearly 8,000 dead. Entire regiments of Cadian reinforcements lost along with the precious cargo of munitions and supplies destined for the embattled world below. The entity Verax managed his throat dry. Omni-Man. What was it? The Magos made a sound that might have been a sigh in a more human throat. Unknown. Initial readings suggest a biological organism of humanoid configuration, but possessing physical properties that defy conventional analysis. The entity survived unprotected void exposure, moved at velocities that should reduce matter to its component atoms due to friction, and demonstrated strength sufficient to breach void shields rated to withstand capital ship weaponry. A demon prince, Verax suggested. Negative. No warp signature detected, no psychic emanations consistent with demonic entities. Whatever this Omni-Man is, it appears to be a material being, albeit one that operates beyond the known physical limitations of realized space. Verax closed his eyes, processing this information. It spoke to me, said it came to save our species from itself. The Magos was silent for a long moment, the only sound the quiet whirring of internal mechanisms as he processed this information. Interesting. Such rhetoric is consistent with certain xenospecies who view conquest as a form of upliftment or salvation. The Toe come to mind. This was no Tau, Verax said firmly. This was something else entirely, something older, more confident. It destroyed our ships, not out of malice or hunger or religious fervour, but with the casual disregard of a man swatting insects. Your testimony will be recorded and transmitted to the proper authorities, the Mago stated. The Inquisition will no doubt take great interest in this new threat. We need more than the Inquisition, Verax said, struggling again to sit up. This time the servitor made no move to stop him. We need the Adeptuses. We need Space Marines. The Magos tilted his head, optical units whirring as they refocused on Vera's face. You believe this entity poses such a threat? I watched it destroy a naval cruiser by flying through it. It moved faster than Auspex could track and shrugged off void shields like they were mist. Yes, Magos. I believe this threat warrants the Emperor's finest. Then it is fortunate that your distress call was received by more than just our vessel, the Magos said, gesturing with a mechanical limb toward the entrance to the Medici Bay. Verax turned his head and felt his breath catch in his throat. Standing in the doorway, a giant even at rest, was a Space Marine in the midnight blue power armour of the Ultramarines. The white laurel markings on his pauldrons identified him as a veteran, and the grim set of his partially visible face spoke of centuries of warfare against the enemies of mankind. Captain Verax, the Space Marine said, his voice a rumbling bass that seemed to vibrate, the very air. I am Brother Captain Titus of the Ultramarine Second Company. I would hear your account of this Omni-Man first-hand. For the first time since the attack, Verax felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. The Emperor had not abandoned them after all. Omni-Man hovered in the upper atmosphere of Cadia, looking down upon the ruined world with an expression of mild disapproval. From this height he could see the massive crack that nearly split the planet in two, sealed now by what appeared to be artificial means. The surrounding landscape was a blasted wasteland, pockmarked with craters and the scars of apocalyptic warfare. Yet, despite this devastation, he could also see the stubborn persistence of human habitation. Fortress cities dotted the inhabitable regions surrounded by vast military encampments and defence installations. Primitive, he murmured to himself, descending through layers of cloud toward the nearest of these fortress cities, but not without potential. His Viltrumite senses detected the targeting systems locking onto him long before he came within range of the actual weapons. Crude atomic warheads, laser arrays, mass drivers, all tracking his approach with increasing urgency. Alarms would be sounding throughout the installation below, troops rushing to battle stations, prayers being offered to their corpse god Emperor. The first salvo of defense lasers lanced up from the surface, brilliant beams of coherent energy that Omni-Man simply sidestepped with casual ease. The second volley came closer to connecting, one beam grazing his shoulder and leaving a scorched mark on his uniform. Omni-Man frowned. The weapons were more accurate than he had anticipated, compensating for his speed with predictive targeting algorithms. He accelerated, pushing his velocity to a fraction of light speed, becoming a blur even to the advanced tracking systems below. The defense grid continued to fire, filling the sky with a web of deadly energy. But Omni-Man navigated through the beams like a dancer weaving through a crowded ballroom. As he neared the surface, missile batteries opened fire, sending hundreds of warheads streaking toward him. Omni-Man smiled grimly, a test of his reflexes. Then he shifted course, flying directly into the heart of the missile swarm. His hands moved in a blur, striking each missile with precisely calculated force, detonating them at a safe distance or redirecting them back toward their launchers. The resulting explosions created a spectacular display of fire and smoke, momentarily obscuring him from the defenders below. Omni-Man used this cover to dive straight down, punching through the armoured dome of the fortress city's central command structure. Reinforced ferrocrete and adamantium plating crumpled beneath his fist, as though it were tissue paper. He found himself in a large command centre surrounded by terrified human officers and tech-augmented priests who stared at him in horror and disbelief. Servitors continued their programmed tasks oblivious to the intrusion. Alarm! Klaxons wailed and red emergency lighting bathed the scene in a hellish glow. "I am Nolan Grayson of Viltrum," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the cacophony of alarms and panicked shouts. "Your world is now under my protection. Resistance is both futile and counterproductive." A brave officer drew a sidearm, some form of laser pistol, and fired point-blank at Omni-Man's chest. The beam struck his uniform and dissipated harmlessly, not even leaving a mark. Omni-Man sighed and flicked a finger against the man's forehead, the seemingly gentle tap crushing the officer's skull and sending his corpse flying across the room to crash against a bank of monitoring equipment. "As I was saying," Omni-Man continued, addressing the remaining command staff who stood frozen in shock and terror, "I have come to elevate your species. The Viltrumite Empire has identified humanity as having potential value. Your current social and political structures are inefficient, your technology crude but promising. Under Viltrumite guidance, you will become stronger." A mechanical voice spoke from behind him. The binary can of the Adeptus Mechanicus translated into Gothic by embedded vocalizers. "The Omnissiah protects. We reject your blasphemy, Xenos entity." Omni-Man turned to face the speaker, a heavily augmented tech priest whose lower body had been replaced by a hovering anti-gravity platform. Multiple mechadendrites extended from his torso, each tipped with a different tool or weapon. "Your religious devotion to technology is misguided." Omni-Man replied, "The Viltrumite approach is one of biological supremacy. We perfect the body and mind first, then supplement with technology only where necessary." The tech priest's response was to unleash a blast of energy from a weapon integrated into one of his mechanical arms. The beam struck Omni-Man in the chest, momentarily enveloping him in crackling energy. When the discharge faded, Omni-Man stood unharmed, though his expression had darkened considerably. "I had hoped for more intelligence from your priesthood of technology," he said, and then moved. To the human observers, he seemed to simply vanish, reappearing behind the tech priest. The hover platform crashed to the ground, its anti-gravity systems destroyed. The tech priest's upper body remained suspended in the air, held aloft by Omni-Man's hand, gripping one of the mechadendrites. With a casual flick of his wrist, Omni-Man tore the priest in two, letting the pieces fall to the floor amid a shower of sparks and fluids, both organic and synthetic. "Now," he continued, turning back to the cowering command staff, "I require information. Which of you commands the military forces of this planet?" A woman stepped forward, her uniform marking her as a high-ranking officer of the Astro Militarum. Her face was a mask of rigid control, though her eyes betrayed her fear. "I am Lord General Iskander Castellan, commander of the Cadian Defense Forces. If you seek surrender, Xenos, you will find none here. Cadia stands." Omni-Man regarded her with something approaching respect. Courage in the face of overwhelming force, admirable if futile. "I do not seek your surrender, Lord General. I seek your evolution. The process will be painful for your generation, but your children and their children will thank you for it." "We will fight you with every weapon at our disposal," Castellan replied, her voice steady. "The Imperium of Man has faced worse threats than you, and endured." Omni-Man smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "No, Lord General, you have not." With that, he was gone, moving so quickly that the sonic boom of his departure shattered every view screen and piece of glass in the command center, leaving the defenders in a shower of broken crystal and the certain knowledge that their world faced a threat unlike any they had encountered before. The Omnissiah's truth maintained a geosynchronous orbit above the northern hemisphere of Cadia, its powerful auger arrays and surveillance systems monitoring the unfolding situation below. In the ship's strategium, Captain Var stood before a holithic display showing a tactical overview of the planet's surface, marked with runes indicating Omni-Man's confirmed attacks and sightings. 17 major military installations destroyed in under 6 hours. Brother Captain Titus observed his massive form dominating the gathering of Imperial officers and adepts. No pattern to the attacks that we can discern, save that he targets command and control nodes with precision. Verax nodded grimly. He is systematically dismantling our defense infrastructure while minimizing civilian casualties, almost surgical in his approach. Curious behavior for a Xenos invader, noted an inquisitor who had joined their council of war. A severe woman with augmentatic eyes who had introduced herself only as Inquisitor Vale of Compish, the Ordo Xenos. Most species bent on conquest either ignore civilian populations entirely or deliberately target them for terror effect. He claimed he came to save our species from itself. Verax reminded them to elevate humanity under the guidance of his Viltrumite empire. The Magos biologist who had treated Verax upon his rescue interjected mechadendrites writhing in agitation. No reference to Viltrum or Viltrumites exists in any Imperial database. This species is unknown to the Imperium. Not all that surprising, Inquisitor Vale said dryly. The galaxy is vast, and our knowledge of what lurks in its outer reaches remains incomplete. Brother Captain Titus stepped closer to the holithic display, studying the pattern of attacks with the tactical acumen bred into all Urtis. He strikes alone. No fleet, no army, no support structure that we can detect. Either supreme confidence or supreme foolishness. Given his demonstrated capabilities, I would suggest the former. Verax said, "We have reports of him withstanding direct hits from lemon rust battle cannon fire without injury. Conventional weapons appear ineffective." The Magos made a sound that might have been disagreement. Negative. Examination of picked captures from the Karskin engagement in Cascallan shows surface damage to the entity's physical form following concentrated hellgun fire. The entity can be injured, though the damage appears to heal at an accelerated rate. This information sent a ripple of renewed hope through the gathered officers. Titus nodded thoughtfully. If it bleeds, it can die. The question becomes one of applying sufficient force to overcome its regenerative capabilities. "The Ultramarines stand ready," continued Titus, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of martial tradition. "We have deployed a full tactical squad to the surface armed with specialized weaponry. Brother Sergeant Amon leads them, a veteran of countless engagements against Xenos threats." Verax felt a surge of gratitude for the presence of the Adeptus estates. If any human force could stand against the power of Omni-Man, it would be the Emperor's Space Marines. Yet a nagging doubt remained. He had witnessed firsthand the casual ease with which Omni-Man had destroyed a naval cruiser. Would even the legendary Space Marines fare any better? "We have another resource at our disposal," Inquisitor Vale said, interrupting Verax's dark thoughts. "The Inquisition maintains certain weapons specifically designed to combat entities that operate beyond normal physical limitations. I have requisitioned one such device from our vaults on Nemesis Tessera." All eyes turned to the Inquisitor, who smiled thinly. A null field generator originally designed to counter the reality-warping powers of greater demons. If this Omni-Man man's abilities stem from some form of energy manipulation or extra-dimensional power source, the null field may disrupt them. "And if they do not?" the Magos inquired. Vale's augmentatic eyes glinted in the low light of the strategium. "Then we learned something valuable about our enemy at the cost of one device." Titus nodded in approval. "A sound strategy. We will incorporate the null field generator into our tactical approach. Brother Sergeant Airman will deploy it at the optimal moment during engagement." The holithic display suddenly flickered, the image dissolving into static before reforming to show a new alert. A communication officer hurried into the strategium, his face pale with urgency. "My lords, my Lady Inquisitor," he began breathless. "We have detected the entity approaching Cassaro Tyrock. Lord General Castellan is personally commanding the defence." Verax felt his blood run cold. Castro Tyro was the largest remaining fortress city on Cadia, home to over 3 million souls and the headquarters of the Cadian High Command. If it fell, the organised defence of the planet would collapse. "How long until the entity reaches the Caesar?" Titus demanded. "At current velocity, approximately 18 minutes, my lord." Titus turned to Verax and the others, his expression grim but determined. "Not enough time to redeploy our forces from their current positions. The Lord General and the defenders of Casa Tyro will have to hold until we can bring our specialized weapons to bear." Verax looked at the tactical display, watching the rune that represented Omni-Men streaking toward the heart of Cadian resistance. "Emperor, protect them," he murmured. "They will need it." Lord General Iskander Castellan stood upon the highest parapet of the great bastion of Casa Tyro, surveying the massive defence preparations below. Every available weapon had been brought to bear, from the great macro-cannon batteries that ring the fortress to the thousands of Cadian shock troops manning the walls. Squadrons of Lemina Russ battle tanks and Basilisk artillery pieces were positioned at strategic intervals, their massive guns elevated toward the sky. In the air above, wings of Valkyrie gunships and Vulture attack craft maintained a combat air patrol ready to intercept the approaching threat. Castellan knew it would not be enough. Reports from the other casses that had fallen to Omniman told the same story. Conventional weapons, no matter how numerous or powerful, simply could not target or damage the entity effectively. Yet, she had no choice but to try. Cadia had stood against the forces of chaos for 10,000 years. It would not fall to a single Xenos entity, no matter how powerful, without exacting a price in blood. "My Lord General," her adjutant approached, offering a Magnus. "The Opperspects arrays have detected the entity approaching from the northeast. Estimated time to engagement 3 minutes. Castellan took the magnulars, focusing them on the indicated vector. At first she saw nothing against the polluted sky, heavy with the smoke of countless battles. Then, a flicker of movement, so fast it was almost imperceptible, caught her eye. She adjusted the focus, enhancing the magnification to maximum. There, a humanoid figure moving at impossible speed, leaving a contrail of disturbed air in his wake. Omniman approached and death came with him. "All batteries, commence firing," she ordered, her voice calm despite the fear that clawed at her gut. "Establish a layered defense grid using predictive targeting protocols. Fighter wings to engage at maximum effective range." The order was relayed, and within seconds the sky erupted with fire and light. Macrock cannons roared, their massive shells streaking toward the approaching figure. Laser batteries unleashed coherent beams of destructive energy, while missile launchers disgorged their deadly payloads in a synchronized barrage designed to saturate the target area. Through her magnulars, Castellan watched as Omniman navigated through the storm of fire with insulting ease. He dodged shells that should have been impossible to evade, weaved between laser beams as though they moved in slow motion, and swatted missiles aside with casual backhand gestures. Not a single hit was scored. The fighter wings moved to engage, Valkyries and Vultures closing in a pincer movement designed to trap the entity between crossing fields of fire. For a moment it seemed to work as Omniman paused in midair, surrounded by Imperial aircraft. Then he moved and carnage followed. He tore through the first Valkyrie like tissue paper, emerging from the other side as the aircraft exploded behind him. He grabbed a second gunship by its nose and swung it like a club, smashing it into a third with such force that both disintegrated in a shower of metal and prometheum. The remaining aircraft attempted to disengage, but Omniman pursued them relentlessly, destroying each in turn with methodical precision. In less than 30 seconds, 2 full wings of Imperial aircraft had been reduced to falling debris, and still Omniman came on, now unopposed in his approach to the fortress. "My Lord General," the adjutant's voice had risen an octave in barely suppressed panic. "He has broken through the air defences. Ground batteries are unable to establish a targeting lock." Castellan lowered the magnulars, her face set in grim determination. "Order all ground forces to concentrate fire on my command. We will create a wall of fire that nothing can penetrate." Even as she gave the order, she knew it was futile. The entity had demonstrated the ability to move faster than targeting systems could track, but she had to try. For Cadia, for the Emperor, all batteries, fire. The very air seemed to ignite as thousands of weapons discharged simultaneously. Battle cannons, hell guns, plasma weapons, bolters, las guns, every gun that could be brought to bear fired at the approaching figure. The combined firepower could have leveled a small city, a hurricane of death that filled the sky with destructive energy. Omniman disappeared within the maelstrom of fire and smoke. For a brief, hope-filled moment, Castellan dared to believe they had succeeded where others had failed. Perhaps sheer volume of fire had accomplished what precision could not. Then the smoke parted, and Omniman emerged unscathed, hovering directly before the parapet where Castellan stood. His uniform showed signs of minor damage, small tears, and scorch marks, but his physical form appeared completely unharmed. He regarded the Lord General with an expression that might almost have been respect. "Impressive," he said, his voice carrying easily over the continuing thunder of guns. "Your species shows remarkable determination in the face of overwhelming odds, a valuable trait that the Viltrumite Empire will cultivate." Castellan drew her power sword, the ancient blade crackling to life with disruptive energy. It was a futile gesture, and both of them knew it, but she was Caden. She would die on her feet, weapon in hand. "Cadia stands," she declared, raising the sword in defiance. "While one Cadon draws breath, we will oppose you." Omniman inclined his head slightly. "Your courage honours you, Lord General, but it changes nothing. Your world will become a part of the Viltrumite Empire, a stepping stone to the unification and strengthening of your entire species. We serve only the Emperor of mankind, Castellan replied, unwavering, not some Xenos conqueror with delusions of godhood. Your Emperor sits rotting on a throne of technology he barely understood, kept alive by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers, Omniman said, his voice hardening. I have seen the truth of your Imperium during my approach through your territory, a failing empire of superstition and stagnation, more concerned with bureaucracy and religious dogma than progress. The Viltrumite way is superior. Through strength, through conquest, through selective breeding, we forge species into their optimal forms. Castellan spat at his feet. We have heard such promises before, from Chaos, from Xenos. We reject them all. The Emperor protects. Your Emperor cannot protect you from me, Omniman said, and then he moved. Castellan swung her power sword with all her strength, the disruptive field surrounding the blade designed to slice through the strongest materials known to the Imperium. The blade connected with Omniman's forearm and stopped dead, its energy field sputtering and dying as the weapon's machine spirit was overwhelmed by the impossible resistance it encountered. Omniman plucked the sword from her grasp and examined it briefly before snapping the blade between two fingers. Interesting technology, but ultimately ineffective. With a casual gesture, he pushed Castellan back, the seemingly gentle touch sending her flying across the parapet to crash into the stone wall with bone-breaking force. Somehow she remained conscious, though blood streamed from her mouth and nose and she could feel the grating of broken ribs with each laboured breath. Your defeat was inevitable, Omniman said, approaching her broken form, but the manner of it was your choice. Remember that as you contemplate your future under Viltrumite rule. He turned away from her, facing the fortress city spread out below. With a deep breath, he rose higher into the air, positioning himself directly above the central administrative complex. Let this serve as a demonstration of futility. He called out, his voice somehow amplified to reach every defender below and as a promise of what awaits those who continue to resist. Then he dove, accelerating to a velocity that created a localized sonic boom. The impact when he struck the central complex was catastrophic. The ground itself seemed to buckle, a shock wave radiating outward that shattered ferrocrete and adamantium alike. Buildings collapsed, defense emplacements crumbled, and a cloud of dust and debris rose into the sky, obscuring the epicenter of destruction. When the dust settled minutes later, a massive crater had replaced what had once been the heart of Casa Tyro. The destruction was total absolute, and hovering above it all, untouched by the devastation he had wrought, was Omnim. Castellan, still clinging to consciousness, felt despair wash over her. How could they fight such power? What weapon in the Imperial arsenal could stand against a being who could destroy a fortress city with a single impact? As darkness claimed her, her last thought was a prayer not for herself but for Cadia. Emperor, protect us, for we cannot protect ourselves. In the darkness of low orbit, the battle barge Macrag's Honor maintained position, its massive form hidden from conventional detection by a combination of stealth technology and the shadow of Cadia's largest moon. Aboard the mighty vessel, Chapter Master Manius Calgar stood before a holithic display showing the devastation of Casa Tyro in real time. The reports were not exaggerated. He observed his voice a deep rumble that matched or his massive frame clad in the armour of Heracles, the ancient Terminator plate making him seem more machine than man. Calgar was the embodiment of ultramarine might and tradition. This Xenos entity represents a significant threat. Beside him, Chief Librarian Tegurius nodded gravely. I have attempted to psychically probe the being known as Omniman. The results were troubling. His mind is shielded. Whether naturally or through some technological means I cannot determine. But I sense something else, a connection to others of his kind, distant yet persistent. He is not alone in the galaxy, merely the vanguard. All the more reason to eliminate this threat before others of his species arrive, Gar stated, his augment hands clenching into fists with a whir of servos. The Codex Astartes is clear on the protocol for dealing with Xenos infiltrators of significant power, overwhelming force applied with precision. Tegurius looked troubled, his ancient face furrowed in concentration. There is more, Lord Calgar. When I attempted to read his future actions, I encountered a phenomenon I have experienced only when dealing with the most powerful entities, multiple potential futures, each more devastating than the last. In many I saw the fall of not just Cadia, but numerous imperial worlds. In others, he trailed off, seemingly reluctant to continue. "Speak freely, old friend," Kalgar encouraged. In others, I saw him standing with humanity against a greater threat. The lines between enemy and ally were blurred in ways I cannot fully comprehend. Kalgar considered this information with the measured patience that had made him one of the greatest strategists in the Imperium. Interesting, but ultimately irrelevant to our immediate concerns. This Omniman has attacked Imperial forces unprovoked and demonstrates clear hostile intent. The response must be decisive. He turned to the third figure who had remained silent during their exchange, a massive space marine whose armour bore the distinctive markings of the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos. Watch. Captain Artemis, his face half obscured by shadow, nodded in agreement. "The Death Watch concurs, Lord Kagar. We have analysed the combat data from the entity's engagements thus far. Conventional weapons are ineffective due to both his extraordinary speed and apparent physical resilience. However, we have identified potential vulnerabilities." Artemis manipulated the holothic display, zooming in on Omniman as he engaged a squadron of Lehman Russ tanks. The footage slowed to a frame-by-frame analysis. Note the micro-expressions of strain when exerting maximum force. The entity is powerful but not limitless. He appears to tire after extended combat, particularly following high-velocity impacts. Additionally, while energy weapons have proven largely ineffective, there is evidence that certain exotic matter interactions may disrupt his physical integrity. "Explain," Kalgar demanded. "The null field generator that Inquisitor Vale mentioned may prove valuable, not for its intended purpose of disrupting warp energies, but for its secondary effect of generating a localized distortion in real space. If the entity's resilience relies on some form of energy field or molecular reinforcement, the null field may temporarily neutralize it." Gar nodded thoughtfully. "A theory worth testing. What of more direct methods?" Artemis changed the display again, showing schematics for several specialized weapons. The Deathwatch maintains an arsenal of Xenophase blades specifically designed to phase through energy shields and physical defenses. Combined with a null field generator and deployed by Astartes in Terminator armor, we may be able to inflict significant damage before the entity can react. "And if these measures fail?" Tigurius asked quietly. Artemis's expression darkened. "Then we escalate to final measures. Exterminatus." A heavy silence fell over the command chamber. Exterminatus was not a decision taken lightly. The complete destruction of a planetary body reserved for only the most extreme threats to the Imperium. That it was being considered at all spoke volumes about the perceived danger Omniman represented. Cadia has endured too much to be sacrificed so readily. Carla said finally, "We will implement the Deathwatch strategy. Prepare the strike force. I will lead it personally." Neither Tigurius nor Artemis showed surprise at this declaration. For all his strategic acumen and leadership responsibilities, Manius Kalgar remained a warrior at heart, one who would not send others to face a danger he was unwilling to confront himself. "As you command, Lord Kalgar," Artemis acknowledged with a salute. "The Deathwatch stands ready." "May the Emperor guide your blade," Tigurius added solemnly. "I will coordinate the psychic assault to distract the entity and mask your approach." Kalgar turned back to the holothic display, studying the figure of Omniman with the cold calculation of a predator assessing its prey. "We strike at dawn." Omniman stood amid the ruins of what had once been the Mechanicus Temple in Casa Tyro, examining the fragmented remains of ancient technology with mild curiosity. The broken forms of tech priests and servitors lay scattered around him, their mechanical components still sparking and twitching in death. He had encountered resistance here more determined than elsewhere. The followers of the machine god fighting with a religious fervour that bordered on the fanatical. It had not saved them. Nothing could. He picked up a fragment of Architect, turning it over in his hands. The device was clearly of human manufacture, but incorporated principles far more advanced than anything else he had encountered in this crumbling empire. Interesting. Perhaps these humans had once possessed greater knowledge, since lost or deliberately suppressed. The sound of approaching footsteps caused him to look up. A lone figure walked through the devastation toward him, seemingly unconcerned by the destruction all around. Clad in simple robes rather than the military uniforms or mechanical augmentations Omniman had encountered thus far, the human appeared unarmed and unafraid. "Greetings, Nolan Grayson of Viltrum," the figure said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I am Interrogator Eisenhorn, representative of the Inquisition. I come to Perry." Omniman raised an eyebrow, setting down the piece of Architect. Parley implies negotiation between equals. There is nothing equal about our positions. Eisenhorn smiled thinly. Perhaps not in terms of physical power, but in terms of information. I believe I have something you lack. Knowledge about this galaxy, this Imperium, and the threats it faces. Threats that even a Viltrumite might find challenging. Despite himself, Omniman felt a flicker of curiosity. During his journey to this planet, he had encountered phenomena unlike anything in Viltrumite experience. Spatial distortions, regions of space where the laws of physics seemed to break down, glimpses of entities that existed at the edge of perception. The locals called it the warp, and feared it with religious intensity. "Speak then," he said, crossing his arms. "What information do you offer that could possibly interest me?" Eisenhorn gestured to the destruction around them. "You destroy our military installations with ease, demonstrating power beyond anything most humans can comprehend. Yet you leave civilian populations largely untouched. You speak of elevating humanity, of incorporating us into your Viltrumite empire. This suggests a purpose beyond mere conquest." "The Viltrumite way is not senseless destruction," Omniman replied. "We conquer to strengthen, to guide species with potential toward their optimal development. Humanity has such potential, buried beneath millennia of superstition and technological regression." "And what of the other powers in this galaxy?" Eisenhorn asked. "Have you encountered the Tyranid hive fleets yet? The Necron dynasties, the corrupting influence of chaos?" Omniman frowned. "I have encountered various xenospecies during my exploration of your territory. None presented any significant challenge. Because you have remained primarily within the boundaries of the Imperium," Eisenhorn explained, "we have held these threats at bay for 10,000 years at incalculable cost in lives and resources. What you perceive as weakness, as stagnation, is in fact the grim necessity of survival in a hostile universe." For the first time, Omniman felt a flicker of doubt. Could this human be telling the truth? The Viltrumite Empire had encountered countless species across multiple galaxies, but none had spoken of threats on the scale this interrogator described. "You claim these threats could challenge even Viltrumite power," he said skeptically. "Yet I have torn through your most formidable defenses without significant effort." Eisenhorn nodded acknowledgement. "The Imperium's strength lies not in individual power, but in numbers, in resilience, in the stubborn refusal to yield no matter the cost. We are not the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, merely the most determined to survive." He took a step forward, his eyes meeting Omniman's without fear. "But consider this. If the Imperium falls to your conquest, who will stand against the Tyranids who consume entire biospheres? Who will oppose the Necrons, who seek to harvest all life to feed their ancient masters? Who will resist the corrupting touch of the ruinous powers, entities that exist beyond physical reality, and seek to unmake creation itself?" Omniman scoffed. "You speak of mythical threats to justify your failing empire, ideal in realities, not superstitions." "Then let me show you reality," Eisenhorn said, reaching into his robes to withdraw a small crystalline device. Before Omniman could react, the device activated, projecting a three-dimensional image into the space between them. The projection showed a vast fleet of organic ships, each resembling some nightmarish hybrid of insect and sea creature, descending upon a world much like Terra. The planet's defences, formidable by human standards, were overwhelmed in minutes. Then came the landing, countless organisms pouring onto the surface, stripping it of all life, all biomass, until nothing remained but barren rock. "The Tyranids," Eisenhorn explained dispassionately, "a hive mind of unimaginable proportions driven by a single imperative: consume. They have devoured entire sectors of space, and each victory makes them stronger." The projection changed, showing humanoid figures of a living metal rising from ancient tombs. Their weapons fired beams of energy that did not burn or explode, but simply caused matter to disintegrate at the molecular level. Armies that stood against them were reduced to dust in seconds. The Necrons, an ancient race who traded their flesh for immortality and bodies of living metal. They seek to reclaim a galaxy they ruled before humanity's ancestors had mastered fire. Again, the image shifted, this time showing something that defied easy description. Humanoid figures twisted and malformed, radiating an energy that seemed to distort the very fabric of reality around them. Where they walked, physics itself began to break down, matter transforming into impossible configurations, living beings mutating into abominations. And this, Eisenhorn said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, is chaos. Not a species, not an empire, but a fundamental force of reality itself, given consciousness and purpose by the emotions and beliefs of sentient beings. It corrupts, it twists, it destroys. Not for conquest or resources, but simply because that is its nature. The projector deactivated, leaving them in the dim light of the ruined temple. Eisenhorn returned the device to his robes. These are the enemies the Imperium faces, Nolan Grayson of Viltrum. Not myths, not superstitions, but realities we confront every day. You may conquer us. You may reshape humanity according to your Viltrumite ideals, but in doing so, you may doom not only humanity, but yourselves as well. Omniman was silent for a long moment, processing what he had seen. The images could be fabrications, of course, propaganda designed to dissuade him from his mission. Yet they aligned with the strange phenomena he had observed during his journey, the inexplicable spatial distortions, the whispers at the edge of perception. You present an interesting perspective, Interrogator, he finally said, but it changes nothing. If these threats are real, then humanity under Viltrumite guidance will be better equipped to face them than your crumbling Imperium. Eisenhorn sighed, a sound of genuine regret. I had hoped for understanding. It seems I must settle for delay. Before Omniman could question this cryptic statement, the ground beneath him erupted in a surge of energy unlike anything he had encountered before. A null field generator buried beneath the temple floor activated at Eisenhorn's remote signal. The device had been planted days earlier when Imperial tacticians identified the Mechanicus Temple as a likely target for Omniman's systematic dismantling of Cadian infrastructure. The null field did not harm Omniman directly, but it created a localized distortion in real space that interfered with the molecular bonds that gave his Viltrumite physiology its extraordinary resilience. For the first time since entering this galaxy, he felt vulnerable. Eisenhorn was already moving, retreating rapidly from the temple as the true purpose of his visit became clear. He had never expected to convince Omniman with words alone. His mission had been to lure the entity into the nullfield trap and keep him there long enough for the real attack to commence. From the skies above, drop pods streaked down like falling meteors, impact retros firing at the last moment to prevent catastrophic ground collision. The pods split open upon landing, disgorging their cargo of Space Marines in Terminator armor, the elite of the Ultramarines First Company, led by Chapter Master Manius Calgar himself. Simultaneously, a psychic assault coordinated by Chief Librarian Tegurius struck at Omniman's mind. While his thoughts remained shielded from direct manipulation, the psychic pressure further disoriented him, creating a moment of weakness that might never come again. The Terminators moved with surprising speed despite their massive armor converging on the temple from all sides. Each wielded a weapon specifically chosen for this engagement. Calgar himself carried the gauntlets of Ultramar, ancient power fists capable of pulverizing tank armor with a single blow. Others wielded thunderhammers, power axes, or the xenophase blades that the Deathwatch had provided. Weapons designed to phase through energy fields and physical defenses alike. Omniman recovered quickly from the initial disorientation, his Viltrumite physiology adapting to the nullfield's effects. But that brief moment of vulnerability had been enough. The Space Marines were upon him, attacking with coordinated precision that spoke of centuries of battlefield experience. A xenophase blade slipped past his guard, drawing first blood, a shallow cut across his chest that would have been insignificant under normal circumstances. But within the null field, the wound did not immediately begin to heal. A second blow, this time from a thunderhammer, struck his shoulder with the force of a small artillery piece, sending him staggering back. For the first time, Omniman felt pain, felt the real possibility of defeat. It was not a sensation he had experienced in many centuries, not since the conquest of the Thraxan homeworld. The realization triggered something primal in his Viltrumite nature, a battle fury that overrode tactical consideration. With a roar of anger, he lashed out, catching the nearest Terminator with a punch that should have torn through ceramite armor like paper. Instead, the blow merely dented the armor plate, cracking but not penetrating it. The Space Marine responded with a swing of his power axe that Omniman barely evaded. "Your resistance is commendable," Omniman snarled, blood trickling from the wound on his chest, but futile, even weakened. "I am more than a match for your warriors." Carr stepped forward. the other Terminators parting to make way for their chapter master. "We shall see, Xenos," he replied, his voice amplified by his armor's voxcasters. "The Emperor's finest have faced worse threats than you and prevailed." What followed was a battle unlike any Cadia had witnessed in its long history of warfare. Omniman, even constrained by the null field, moved with blinding speed, striking with force that could shatter stone. The Space Marines countered with the perfect coordination of warriors who had fought side by side for centuries, each movement calculated to support their brothers, each attack designed to probe for weaknesses. Blood flew from new wounds on Omniman's body, as the Xenopha's blades found their mark again and again, yet for each blow the Space Marines landed, they paid in kind. One Terminator lay broken, his armor crushed by a blow that had somehow penetrated his defenses. Another had lost an arm, the limb torn free at the shoulder joint despite the reinforced nature of Terminator plate. Kagar himself engaged Omniman directly, the gauntlets of Ultramar meeting flesh with thunderous impacts that echoed through the ruined temple. Each blow would have pulverized an ordinary opponent, but Omniman weathered the assault, his resilience astonishing even in his weakened state. "You fight well for humans," Omniman acknowledged, blood streaming from multiple wounds now. "But you must realize the futility of your position. Even if you defeat me here, more Viltrumites will come. Our empire spans galaxies. Your Imperium is but one realm among many that will eventually kneel before Viltrim." Kalgar's response was not in words, but in action. Timing his attack perfectly with the rhythm of combat, he feinted with his left gauntlet, drawing Omniman's guard high, then struck with his right in a devastating uppercut that connected squarely with the Viltrumite's jaw. The impact lifted Omniman off his feet, sending him crashing into a support column with enough force to bring down a section of the already damaged ceiling. For a moment it seemed the battle might be won. Omniman lay amid the rubble, momentarily stunned by the force of the blow. The Space Marines closed in, weapons raised for the killing stroke, then the null field generator, strained beyond its design parameters by the energies it had been containing, failed. The distinctive hum that had permeated the temple died away, and with it the localized distortion that had been Omniman's only real vulnerability. The change was immediate and terrifying. Omniman rose from the rubble, his wounds already beginning to heal, his eyes blazing with a fury that promised death. When he moved now, it was with the full measure of his Viltrumite speed, becoming a blur that the Space Marines could barely track, let alone counter. The first Terminator died before he could even register the attack, his helmet crushed along with the head inside it. The second was torn in half, his armor offering no more resistance than fabric. The third managed to fire his Stormbolter, the mass-reactive shells detonating against Omniman's skin with no visible effect, before a hand punched through his chestplate and ripped out his primary heart. "Fall back," Kalgar ordered, recognizing the disastrous shift in the battle's dynamics. "Tactical withdrawal. Brother Titus, deploy the contingency." The surviving Space Marines began a fighting retreat, laying down covering fire with Stormbolters and plasma weapons. Omniman pursued them relentlessly, his earlier words about elevating humanity forgotten in the heat of battle rage. This was the true face of Viltrumite conquest, not the philosophical justifications he had offered, but the raw, brutal application of overwhelming physical power. Yet even in retreat, the Space Marines demonstrated why they were the Emperor's finest warriors. They withdrew in perfect order, each movement coordinated to maximize survival. Those with ranged weapons covered those without, sacrificing rate of fire for accuracy, aiming for Omniman's eyes and other vulnerable points. It was not enough to harm him, but it slowed his advance fractionally, allowing the majority of the strike force to reach the extraction point. Dropships descended through the smoke-filled sky, their heavy bolters providing additional covering fire as the Space Marines boarded. Kagar was the last to withdraw, standing his ground against Omniman's onslaught to buy his brothers time to escape. The gauntlets of Ultramar, artifacts that had served the chapter for millennia, shattered under the force of Omniman's blows. Kamit cracked, internal systems failed, and even Kalgar's enhanced physiology reached its limits. As the chapter master finally turned to board the last dropship, Omniman moved to intercept, determined that none would escape his wrath. It was at that moment that Brother Titus deployed the contingency Kalgar had ordered. From orbit, the Mekri's Honor fired its main batteries not at Omniman directly, for such an attack would have been futile, but at the ground beneath the temple. Lance strikes of devastating power carved into Cadia's already wounded crust, penetrating to the unstable geological formations below. The temple and the ground beneath it began to collapse, opening into a chasm that dropped away for kilometres all the way to the network of blackstone deposits that formed Cadia's skeletal structure. Omni-Man, caught in the collapsing terrain, disappeared into the abyss. Calgar, barely conscious from his wounds, was pulled aboard the dropship moments before it too would have been claimed by the widening chasm. The vessel's engine strained as it fought to escape the devastation, joining the others in a desperate ascent back to the safety of orbit. From the MacGregor's Honour, Tigurius watched the destruction with grim satisfaction. The plan had not succeeded in eliminating Omni-Man, but it had bought them time, and in war, time was often the most precious resource of all. He will survive that. The librarian observed as Kagar was brought to the medikit deck. His injuries severe even by Astarte standards, but it will slow him down. The blackstone deposits interfere with many forms of energy, and may temporarily disrupt whatever power source fuels his extraordinary abilities. Kagar, drifting in and out of consciousness as the medic servitors worked to stabilize his condition, managed a weak nod. Enough time to implement the final solution. Tigurius's expression darkened. Are you certain, Lord Kagar? Exterminatus is not a decision to be taken lightly, especially for a world as significant as Cadia. The alternative is worse, Calgar replied, his voice strengthening as his enhanced healing began to take effect. If this Omni-Man is merely the vanguard of a larger force, we cannot allow him to establish a foothold. Better that Cadia falls, then it becomes the staging ground for a Viltrumite invasion of the Imperium. Tigurius bowed his head in reluctant acceptance. As you command, Lord Calgar, the necessary preparations will be made. As the MacRae's Honour moved into position for the ultimate sanction far below on Cadia's surface in the darkness of the chasm, something stirred. Omni-Man rose from the rubble, his uniform torn, his body showing signs of injury that, while already healing, spoke to the effectiveness of the Space Marine's attack. More concerning were the strange effects of the blackstone deposits all around him. His strength seemed diminished, his senses dulled, as though the very substance of this planet's core interfered with the connection between his physical form and the energy that empowered it. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Nolan Grayson felt a flicker of genuine concern. These humans were more resourceful, more determined than he had anticipated. The Viltrumite conquest would not be the simple matter of demonstration and submission that it had been on countless other worlds. He took flight, pushing against the strange dampening effect of the blackstone rising slowly toward the surface. As he emerged from the chasm, he saw the devastation wrought by the orbital bombardment. The temple was gone, along with several square kilm of the surrounding area, leaving only a massive crater that glowed with residual energy from the lance strikes. Looking up at the sky, Omni-Man could make out the silhouette of a massive vessel moving into low orbit. Even from this distance, he could see the distinctive profile of weapon systems being brought to bear. They meant to destroy the entire planet rather than allow him to conquer it. Such determination was rare among the species the Viltrumites had subjugated. Most valued their survival above all else, surrendering rather than facing extinction. These humans, with their fanatical devotion to their corpse god Emperor, their willingness to sacrifice billions to deny their enemies victory, represented a different kind of challenge. Omni-Man smiled grimly. Perhaps this conquest would prove interesting after all. On the bridge of the Macrogas Honour, the final preparations for Exterminatus were underway. The ship's cyclonic torpedoes, planet-killing weapons of last resort, were armed and ready for deployment. Chapter Master Calgar, his wounds stabilized but far from healed, stood before the command pulpit, the weight of the decision he was about to make visible in every line of his ancient face. "May the Emperor forgive us," he murmured, raising his hand to give the final order. Before he could speak the words that would condemn Cadia to destruction, the ship's OPEX arrays detected a new anomaly. A rift opened in real space directly ahead of the battle barge, a tear in the fabric of reality that pulsed with energies both familiar and utterly alien. "Warp incursion," the officer of the watch called out, his voice tight with tension. "Classification unknown." From the rift emerged a vessel unlike any in Imperial records. It resembled a sleek predatory bird, its hull composed of a material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. It was smaller than the MacRae's Honour, perhaps the size of a light cruiser, but the energy readings it generated surpassed anything the Imperial sensors could properly categorize. "Hail them," Kagar ordered, his tactical mind immediately reassessing the situation. All weapons lock on target. Before the communications officer could comply, the unknown vessel transmitted on all frequencies, its message clear and chilling. "This is Supreme Commander Thrag of the Viltrumite Empire," a voice declared, its tone carrying the same cold authority that Omniman had displayed. "We have come for Nolan Grayson. Interference will result in your immediate destruction." Calgar exchanged glances with Tigurius, both recognizing the implications. This was not a full invasion force, but a retrieval mission. For whatever reason, the Viltrumites wanted Omniman back. "An opportunity," Tigurius murmured, "or a greater threat?" "Both," Calgar replied grimly. "Open a channel." The communications officer complied, establishing a Vox link with the Viltrumite vessel. "This is Chapter Master Manius Calgar of the Ultramarines," he transmitted. "Your emissary, Omniman, has committed acts of war against the Imperium of Man. He will answer for these crimes." There was a pause before the response came, a pause that suggested not hesitation, but contempt. "Your Imperium is of no concern to the Viltrumite Empire," Thrag replied. "Nolan Grayson has exceeded his authority. He was sent to scout, not to conquer. His actions do not represent official Viltrumite policy at this time." Calgar's eyes narrowed at the careful phrasing. "At this time, the Viltrumite Empire expands according to a specific protocol," Thrag explained, his tone suggesting he was discussing a matter of bureaucratic procedure rather than galactic conquest. "Scouts assess potential worlds for integration, reports are filed, decisions are made. Nolan has violated this protocol by engaging in unauthorized conquest. We will retrieve him and depart. Your world will remain under your control for now, and if we refuse to allow this retrieval," Calgar challenged. The response was immediate and left no room for negotiation. "Then we will take him by force and your world will suffer the consequences. Choose quickly, Chapter Master. My patience is limited." Calgar muted the transmission, turning to his command staff. "Options." Tigurius spoke first, his psychic senses straining to gather any information about the Viltrumite vessel and its occupants. "I sense multiple entities aboard that ship, each radiating power similar to Omniman. We cannot fight them all, not with our current resources. The Codex Astartes offers guidance for such situations," Calgar mused. "When faced with an enemy of overwhelming strength, seek not victory but survival. Live to fight another day." "You suggest we allow them to retrieve Omniman?" Tigurius asked, surprise evident in his voice. "After all the destruction he has caused?" Gar's expression was grim but determined. "I suggest we allow them to believe that is our intention. Meanwhile, we gather intelligence, prepare defenses, and alert the High Lords of Terror to this new threat. The Imperium must be ready when the Viltrumites return in force." Tigurius nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in this approach. A temporary retreat to secure ultimate victory. The Primarch would approve. Calgar reopened the channel to the Viltrumite vessel. "Supreme Commander Thrag, the Imperium of Man acknowledges your request. We will not interfere with your retrieval of Nolan Grayson. However, know this. Any future incursion into Imperial space will be met with the full force of our military might. The Emperor protects, and we are his sword." There was no reply for several seconds, then simply noted. The Viltrumite vessel moved past the Macra's honor, descending into Cadia's atmosphere. On the tactical display, Calgar watched as it homed in on Omniman's position with unerring accuracy, suggesting some form of biological or technological link between Viltrumites. "Track them," he ordered. "Full sensor sweep. I want every scrap of data we can gather on their capabilities." The bridge crew complied, directing the battle barge's sophisticated OPEX arrays to record every detail of the Viltrumite ship's descent. Whatever happened next would shape the Imperium's response to this new threat. Omniman sensed the arrival of the Viltrumite vessel before he saw it. A familiar presence brushed against his consciousness, a connection to his own kind that transcended physical distance. He looked up as the ship broke through Cadia's cloud cover, its design unmistakably Viltrumite, despite the modifications it had undergone since he last saw it. Thrag had come for him personally. That did not bode well. The vessel landed in the crater created by the orbital bombardment, its landing struts extending to stabilize it on the uneven ground. A hatch opened in its vententral surface, and a figure descended slowly to the ground below. Supreme Commander Thrag stood even taller than Omniman, his muscular frame draped in the traditional white and blue uniform of Viltrumite leadership, a cape of deep crimson signifying his supreme rank. His beard was full and dark, framing a face etched with the experience of thousands of years of warfare and conquest. Nolan Thrag greeted him, his voice neutral but with an undercurrent of displeasure. "You have created quite a situation." Omniman straightened, wiping blood from a wound that was already closing. "Supreme Commander, I did not expect a personal retrieval. Your unauthorized actions warranted direct intervention," Thrag replied, his gaze sweeping over the devastation surrounding them. "This was meant to be a reconnaissance mission. Observe, report, withdraw. Instead, you engaged in open conquest without authorization. I saw an opportunity." Omniman defended himself. "This Imperium is vast but fragile, held together by superstition and fear rather than true strength. The humans have potential, but their current leadership squanders it under Viltrumite guidance. That decision is not yours to make." Thrag cut him off sharply. "We follow protocol for a reason, Nolan, especially in a new galaxy where the variables are unknown. Your encounter with these Space Marines proves my point. They very nearly killed you." Omniman bristled at the observation. "They caught me by surprise with technology we have not encountered before. It would not happen a second time." "Perhaps not," Thrag conceded, "but it raises questions about what other surprises this galaxy might hold. The energy readings we detected during our approach suggest anomalies, unlike anything in our previous conquests. The Empire requires more data before committing to full-scale invasion." "So, we retreat?" Omniman asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Leave these humans to their failing Imperium." Thrag's expression hardened. "We withdraw, Nolan. For now, the High Council will review your reconnaissance data and determine the appropriate course of action. If conquest is deemed viable, you will have your chance to return." Omniman knew better than to argue further. Despite his own considerable power, Thrag was one of the few Viltrumites who could defeat him in direct combat, and beyond that, the Supreme Commander spoke with the authority of the High Council itself. "As you command," he acquiesced, though his eyes lingered on the ruined landscape of Cadia. "But I maintain that this species has potential. With proper guidance, they could become valuable assets to the Empire." Thrag nodded, a hint of understanding in his expression. "Your assessment will be included in the report. Now come, we have lingered here long enough." Together they ascended to the waiting vessel. As the hatch closed behind them, Omniman cast one final glance at the world he had so briefly terrorized. The humans had surprised him with their resilience, their willingness to sacrifice everything rather than submit. It was a quality the Viltrumites respected even as they sought to overcome it. The ship rose silently into the sky, accelerating toward the rift in space that had brought it to this galaxy. As they approached the anomaly, Omniman felt a question form in his mind, one that he had not considered during the heat of conquest. "How did you find me?" he asked Thrag. "This galaxy is vast, and I left no trail to follow." Thrag's expression remained impassive. "You were summoned, Nolan, not by us, but by something in this galaxy, something that reached across the void between realities and pulled you through." "Impossible," Omniman protested. "I came through a spatial anomaly I discovered during routine patrol of Sector 7. A convenient anomaly," Thrag noted. "One that appeared precisely in your patrol route, calibrated to your specific quantum signature. We detected the energy pattern when it activated. It was not random, Nolan. You were targeted." The implications were disturbing. In all their conquests across multiple galaxies, the Viltrumites had never encountered a power capable of such manipulation of space-time, let alone one that could specifically target and transport an individual Viltrumite across such vast distances. "By whom?" Omniman demanded. "For what purpose?" Thrag's gaze turned toward the view screen where the swirling energies of the rift awaited them. Whatever entity possesses such power represents either a significant threat or a potential ally. Either way, the Viltrumite Empire must know more before committing to conquest in this galaxy. The ship entered the rift, reality distorting around them as they prepared to return to Viltrumite space. Omniman's last glimpse of the Imperium of Man was the massive form of the Ultramarines' battle barge hanging in orbit above Cadia, a symbol of humanity's stubborn defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. "We will return," he murmured to himself as the rift closed behind them, sealing off this galaxy from Viltrumite influence. At least for now. Aboard the Macragger's Honor, Chapter Master Calgar watched the energy signature of the Viltrumite vessel disappear from the Auspex arrays. The immediate threat had passed, but the implications remained. A new Xenos power had revealed itself, one with capabilities that rivaled or exceeded anything in Imperial experience, save perhaps the most ancient of threats. "They will return," Tigurius said, giving voice to Kalgar's thoughts. "I have seen it in the strands of possible futures. This was merely the first contact." Kalgar nodded grimly. "Then we must be ready. Cadia has endured the worst that chaos could unleash. It will stand against these Viltrumites as well." "What of Inquisitor Vale's theory?" Tigurius asked. "That some entity deliberately brought Omniman to our galaxy." "A concerning possibility," Kalgar acknowledged. "One that bears further investigation. If some power is capable of reaching across galaxies to summon beings of such strength, what else might it bring forth? And to what end?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. With current knowledge, Kurgar turned to the communications officer. "Prepare a full report for Terra. The High Lords must be informed and contact Lord Admiral Spire. The Imperial Navy will need to establish new patrol patterns to watch for further Viltrumite incursions." As the crew hastened to obey, Kurgar moved to the viewports that looked down upon Cadia's scarred surface. The planet had endured yet another trial, emerging wounded but unbroken. How many more such trials could it withstand? "We endure," he murmured, the motto of the Imperium itself, forged in the crucible of 10,000 years of constant warfare. "We adapt, we overcome." In the depths of space, far beyond the boundaries of the Imperium, far even beyond the boundaries of the known galaxy, something ancient stirred. It had reached out and plucked a champion from another reality, testing its strength against the defenders of this realm. The results had been informative, if not entirely conclusive. The entity, formless and vast, extended its consciousness toward other realities, other dimensions, seeking new champions to draw into its grand experiment. The Viltrumite had been merely the first. Others would follow, warriors and monsters from across the multiverse, each bringing unique powers and perspectives to challenge the established order of this galaxy. And through their conflicts, their triumphs and failures, the entity would learn about strength, about resilience, about the nature of power itself. Knowledge that would serve it well when the time came for its own emergence from the shadows of creation. In the ruined temple on Cadia's surface, where Omniman had battled the Space Marines, something glinted amid the rubble. A small fragment of his uniform torn loose during the combat and left behind when Thrag retrieved him. A seemingly insignificant remnant, yet containing within its alien fibers the biological markers of Viltrumite DNA. A servitor, part of a Mechanica salvage team searching for recoverable technology, discovered the fragment. Its basic programming recognized the anomalous nature of the material and categorized it for retrieval and analysis. The fragment was placed in a containment unit along with other items of potential interest and transported to the nearest Mechanicus research facility. There, in the sterile environment of a high-security laboratory, tech priests would study the Viltrumite genetic material, marveling at its resilience, its complexity, its potential, and perhaps in their quest for knowledge and advancement. They would take the first steps down a path that would eventually lead to humanity's own evolution. For better or worse, the wheels of fate turned. The galaxy held its breath, and in the void between realities, ancient powers watched and waited for the next act in the cosmic drama to unfold. Captain Thaddeus Verax stood on the rebuilt ramparts of Casa Tiro, gazing out over the landscape that still bore the scars of Omniman's brief but devastating campaign. 6 months had passed since the Viltrumite's departure. Months of rebuilding, of mourning, of preparing for a return that Imperial tacticians considered inevitable. A voice called from behind him. Verax turned to see a young Cadian officer approaching, wearing the uniform of the recently formed Viltrumite Response Division, a specialized unit of the Astra Militarum dedicated to developing countermeasures against the specific threat Omniman had represented. Lieutenant Kelvax acknowledged what news from the research division. Kel handed over a data slate, his expression carefully neutral. The Mechanicus believes they have developed a prototype weapon based on the null field technology. Initial tests are promising, though limited by our understanding of Viltrumite physiology. Verax scanned the technical specifications, most of which exceeded his comprehension. The Mechanicus guarded their technological secrets jealously, sharing only what was absolutely necessary with the military forces who would deploy their creations. "And the wider preparations?" he asked, returning the slate. "Proceeding according to schedule," Kel replied. "Early warning systems have been established in key sectors, drawing on both conventional OPEX technology and the Astronomican's psychic network. If the Viltrumites return, we will have warning. Verax nodded, turning his gaze back to the horizon. It will not be enough, he said quietly. You did not face him as I did, Lieutenant. Even with all our preparations, even with the full might of the Imperium brought to bear, we may only be delaying the inevitable. Kel's youthful face hardened with the determination that characterized all cadence. Then we delay it as long as possible. Cadia stands. Captain, it has always stood against every threat the galaxy has thrown at it. Yes, Verax agreed, his hand unconsciously rising to touch the Aquila medallion at his throat. Cadia stands. The Emperor protects. But as he spoke the familiar words, he could not help but wonder if even the Emperor's protection would be enough against the might of the Viltrumite Empire. Only time would tell, and in the grim darkness of the far future, time was perhaps the cruelest enemy of all. For now, though, humanity endured, as it always had, as it always would, until the stars themselves grew cold and the last human breath faded into the eternal silence of a dying universe. On the Viltrumite homeworld, Nolan Grayson stood before the High Council. His report on the Imperium of Man concluded. The chamber was silent as the assembled leaders of the most powerful species in their galaxy considered the implications of his discoveries. This Imperium, one councillor finally spoke, spans 1 million worlds, you say? At minimum, Omniman confirmed, though many are barely inhabited, serving primarily as resource extraction points or military outposts, and they have maintained this domain for 10,000 years. Another councillor asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Despite the threats you described, these tyrannids, these necrons, this chaos, according to their historical records, yes, Omniman replied, though I suspect there is significant mythologizing in their accounts. The practical reality is likely far more complex and less successful than their propaganda suggests. Thrag, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. Regardless of the exact details, the fact remains that this Imperium represents a civilization of significant scale and resilience. More importantly, it exists in a galaxy that harbours threats unlike any we have encountered in our previous conquests. The council chambers fell silent again as the members contemplated this assessment. The Viltrumite Empire had expanded through multiple galaxies over thousands of years, encountering and subjugating countless species. None had presented a significant challenge to Viltrumite supremacy. The idea that this new galaxy might contain powers that could genuinely threaten them was novel and disturbing. What of the entity that brought you there? The eldest councillor asked, fixing Omniman with a penetrating stare. Have we identified its nature or purpose? Negative, Thrag answered for him. Our scientists have analysed the energy signature of the rift that transported Nolan. It contains elements similar to what these humans call the warp, but with distinct differences that suggest an intelligence behind its formation. Whatever created it possesses technology or abilities far beyond our current understanding, a deliberate test. Then, the eldest councillor mused. This entity selected Nolan specifically, transported him to this Imperium, and observed the resulting conflict. The question is why? Perhaps to assess our strength, one councillor suggested. Or the strength of the Imperium, or both, another added. A comparative analysis of two powerful civilizations by a third party with unknown motives. Omniman listened to the debate with growing impatience. Always the same with the council. Endless discussion while action was delayed. Whatever the reason, he interjected, the fact remains that the Imperium now knows of our existence. They will be preparing for our return. The longer we delay, the more time they have to develop countermeasures. Thrag shot him a warning glance, but several councillors nodded in agreement with Omniman's assessment. Nolan raises a valid point. One said, strategic advantage often lies with the first to strike decisively. Yet haste may lead us into a conflict we do not fully understand, countered another. These warp phenomena, Nolan described, these entities that exist beyond physical reality, they represent unknown variables in our conquest equation. The debate continued for hours with factions forming around various approaches. Some advocated for immediate invasion, leveraging the knowledge gained from Omniman's reconnaissance. Others urged caution, suggesting further surveillance and intelligence gathering before committing to full-scale conflict. A third faction proposed a diplomatic approach rare in Viltrumite history, but occasionally employed when dealing with species of unusual potential. Finally, Thrag raised his hand, silencing the chamber. The council has heard all perspectives. Now we must decide. As Supreme Commander, I offer my recommendation. We will proceed with a limited engagement targeting specific Imperial worlds far from their core territories. This will allow us to gather more intelligence about their military capabilities while establishing footholds in their galaxy. Based on the results of these operations, we can then determine whether full conquest is viable. The Council voted and Thrag's recommendation was approved by a narrow margin. Omniman accepted the decision with outward composure, though inwardly he chafed at the cautious approach. The Imperium of Man represented the most significant challenge the Viltrumite Empire had faced in centuries. It deserved their full attention, their full strength. As the Council disbanded, Thrag approached him privately. "You disagree with the decision," he stated, not a question but an observation. "I believe we underestimate the threat," Omniman replied frankly. "Not from their conventional forces, but from the other powers in that galaxy. If these chaos entities are even half as dangerous as Imperial records suggest, we should either commit fully to conquest or avoid that galaxy entirely." Thrag studied him thoughtfully. "Your experience has changed you, Nolan. You speak of these humans with a respect I have not heard you extend to any species since the Thraxans." Omniman could not deny it. They fight with a determination that exceeds their physical capabilities, and their champions, these Space Marines, are formidable even by our standards. In different circumstances, they might have made worthy additions to the Empire. "Perhaps they still might," Thrag said, surprising him. "Conquest is not our only path to expansion. The Council's diplomatic faction grows stronger with each passing century. Some argue that certain species offer more value as allies than as subjects." The concept was so contrary to traditional Viltrumite philosophy that Omniman could only stare at his commander in shock. Thrag's expression remained inscrutable. "Rest, Nolan," the Supreme Commander advised. "Recover your strength. When the time comes for our return to that galaxy, I want you at your peak. Whatever approach we ultimately take, your experience will be invaluable." As Thrag departed, Omniman found himself contemplating a future very different from the one he had envisioned. The Viltrumite Empire had existed for millennia on a simple principle: the strong rule, the weak serve. But what happened when the strong encountered others who, while perhaps not equal in physical power, possessed qualities that made them formidable in different ways? The question had no easy answer, but as he looked up at the stars visible through the council chamber's transparent dome, Omniman found himself oddly eager to discover what that answer might be. The paths of two civilizations had crossed briefly, violently, then separated again, but the connection had been established. And in the vast tapestry of cosmic history, such connections rarely remained severed for long. Sooner or later, the Imperium of Man and the Viltrumite Empire would meet again, and when they did, the galaxy itself would tremble with the consequences. In the meantime, the stars burned on, indifferent to the struggles of the beings who lived in their light. The universe continued its inexorable expansion, and somewhere in the void between realities, ancient eyes watched and waited and planned for the next move in a game as old as time itself.